Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a political podcast that forgot how EU elections work. And how are you doing today, Rob?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm just a bit annoyed that we had the slight mess up of the schedule. So we were going to record about the EU MEP elections today. Unfortunately, lots of countries in Europe have a law whereby all of their elections are on a Sunday, which means we can't talk about it until after 10 p.m. this Sunday. So we can talk about general stuff. I mean, this is not like, we're not a news organisation, so we can talk about stuff in general in like the news section. But our main story tonight is going to be much more closer to home because it's been an interesting day, hasn't it, Rob?
Boy, howdy has it. We will get into it more, but you don't usually get the passing of one prime minister onto another. And again, this is another one of like those bookmarks in history. We'll look at this in years to come and think that was the moment that Theresa May stood down.
So, I mean, without further ado, I suppose we'll move on from that into our main story tonight. And our main story tonight is the fact that, well, as I was driving into work this morning, I got a message from one of our listeners saying the podium's out. And I think we all knew what that meant at the time. And it wasn't therefore surprising that within about an hour there had been a speech. I'm very impressed at some of the podcasts I follow because I listened to the Economist podcast, and they had their episode up middle of the day already with like quotes from that in it. So I mean, we're not that speedy with the news, but at least we're recording on the same day. I mean, how did we get here, Rob?
I mean, to be a little unfair to Theresa May, I imagine some news outlets might have been preparing for her resignation for quite some time and thought it may have happened sooner than now. So they may have been lining up those quotes or lining up those sort of, memorials to Theresa May even before the event happened. So, yes, I just wanted to... We've talked about it a bit in Headline Quickfire, so why now? So I wanted to firstly reflect on the short-term issue that brought it to a head, because, as I've just mentioned, she's been under threat a lot of times. Why was this the straw that broke the camel's back? So... this fourth attempt at passing a deal, we've already mentioned that promise of a second referendum, and Theresa May's thinking behind this was that even though talks had failed between her and Labour, if she offered a second referendum, that might be a very difficult prospect for those on the other side of the House to turn down. So even though she'd annoy senior Conservatives, that might convince Labour, who have a second referendum sort of written into their constitution as a result of that vote that they had at their party conference. It would also force people like the Lib Dems, Change, the SNP to get what they want. This might have been a smart play, but the problem is that Labour just swiftly rejected it. They said, no, even with this second referendum in place, we're not going to vote for it. We still think your deal falls well short of what we expect. Labour have been pushing for a customs union type agreement that clearly wasn't, that May wasn't able to deliver as part of the talks. And as soon as Labour said they are out, there was no political gain for anybody from the Lib Dems or Change to say, oh, we would have voted for the deal. They just kept quiet and said, yeah, we won't vote for it. If Labour aren't doing it, then there's no chance it will pass. We won't support this. On the other hand, it had annoyed a lot of very senior Conservatives within Theresa May's cabinet. Many Brexiteers felt that the promise of a second referendum was against the pledge in their manifesto. And, more importantly, it would help alienate more Conservative voters away from the Conservative Party. The Conservatives have just faced one of their biggest losses in council elections in 20 years. They were effectively wiped out. And the European elections don't look like they're going to be much better. To have an embarrassing sort of defeat like this on the cards, and the Brexiteers quickly seeing that May didn't have a plan B, that she was only going to keep resubmitting their plan, they had to take control of the situation.
We've been talking about this before, right? How does she keep presenting the same deal? And this is the straw that broke the camel's back, right?
Yeah, it's the first one that's really aimed to annoy senior Brexiteers or cabinet Brexiteers. Some of them have abstained or some of them have reluctantly voted for it. I think on the third time of asking, if you remember, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson even voted for her deal in the hope that enough people would be convinced to come through. But that party loyalty wasn't enough to get it across the line. It still needed some cross-party support. So this is Theresa May going entirely in on the cross-party support thing, but neglecting her own party. The resignation of Andrea Leadsom, the leader of the House, the woman who had stood against Theresa May in the last Conservative leadership election, a woman who was a prominent Brexiteer and had still gone on television, she'd gone on Mars, she'd been on the sofa and smiled her way through every interview and said, no, I believe in Theresa May's Brexit deal. You know, even me, a Brexiteer, I'll keep doing that. If you lose the faith the faith of her, the person who was going to be the one to deliver your legislation and organise its passing through the House, that's kind of the end for you. And the cabinet options for May were dwindling. There was nowhere to go from her point of view. And as I've written here, we're a week away from, a week's passed since Eurovision, but Theresa May was finally facing her Waterloo. And there was no other choice but surrender in this matter.
I hope you spent a long time coming up with that, Rob.
I did.
We can come up with, we can have our unofficial side Eurovision podcast where we discuss. We was robbed. Anyway, yeah. So how far back do you want to go? We've talked about this week and kind of and a bit of the withdrawal agreement, but you've got a note here. So how did it start? Which I feel is harking back to the referendum, maybe.
Yeah. So I want to just think of Theresa May's path to the leadership and why it was so unconventional for a leader, and where once she was doing things so right, it has gone so wrong, and so to pinpoint where it's gone wrong and why. And maybe, good eye, mate. Sorry, I don't know why I went Australian there. And maybe why it's, what were the catalysts for that breakdown between her and the Conservative Party. So I was going to go to the aftermath of the referendum and the Conservative election campaign. So David Cameron's just stepped down as leader, and we have a plethora of Conservative figures coming to the fore. Most namely, prominent Brexiteer Boris Johnson, supported by Michael Gove at the time. We had Andrea Leadsom, Liam Fox, again Brexiteers, but mostly unknown. And then on the Remainer side, we had a handful, but Theresa May was the figure from the sort of Remainer faction of the party that stood out. She'd been Home Secretary before. She seemed to tie down that job fairly well. She was seen as a safe pair of hands.
I was going to say, what were your opinions at the time? Because I remember it was before we had this podcast, so we didn't discuss it here. And I remember there were a lot of, we've already mentioned Boris got stabbed in the back by Gove, and they kind of went down quite quickly. And then we had, his name escapes me, we had the very homophobic guy who basically I was against on those grounds.
Stephen Crabb, I think it was?
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, all I remember about him was he was very homophobic, so he was right out. And again, we don't have any control in this process. I think it's... I can't remember... We'll get onto how that works later, but I believe it's that there's like two stages where there's like MPs and then it goes to the Conservative membership. But essentially, it was very quick. And I remember feeling like, well, while I don't agree with some of the things Theresa May has done in the Home Office, especially she seems to misunderstand how the internet works. We've now seen various things that happened in her tenure there coming out with like Windrush and everything. But like in general, I was like, oh, she's a bit authoritarian for me. But out of the options, I think I'd agree with what you said. A safe pair of hands, someone who'd been in government for some time and had form getting things done at least. How the turns table.
I'd agree entirely with that. It's the safe pair of hands, the experience of being in government, a recognisable face. The stuff coming from the Brexiteer side may have been a little bit too sort of... It was quite radical. The people who were putting themselves forward had never really had a big part in government, and those who had, like Liam Fox, had to leave in disgrace. He'd had to... The
disgraced former Defence Secretary, Liam Fox.
Exactly.
I still have that extension on Google Chrome so that it always changes his name to it.
So out of the options, she seemed like the best of a bad bunch. And one thing I thought maybe a little naively at the time was that she had formally voted for Remain, but now had to leave, had to lead a country to Brexit. And in my opinion, that was the person who you wanted to. That was a person who could, have a compromise. We've all mentioned about how close the vote was, but the vote is binding and they will go ahead with it. But I thought that would lead to a relatively balanced and stable Brexit option putting through. It wouldn't be too sort of wild. It wouldn't too be sort of flag bashing. This would be one that she might be able to unite the country behind. And indeed, I've brought up here, and I might put a link in the chat to it. Her first speech as leader was quite promising, I felt, or at least not as overtly sort of right-wing or authoritarian as it could have been.
Well, that's an old photo of her as well. If she looked like that when she made her speech, then the office has aged her, and I know that's the thing that being Prime Minister or President does, but I don't think that's a photo from when she gave the speech, if I'm honest.
No, sorry, that's an old Home Secretary one. But so the lines I wanted to point out was that if you're black, you're treated more harshly by the criminal justice system than if you're white. If you're a white working class boy, you're less likely than anyone else in Britain to go to university. If you're in a state school, you are less likely to reach the top professions than if you are educated privately. If you're a woman, you will earn less than a man. You will suffer from mental health problems. There's not enough help at hand. If you are young, you'll find it harder than ever before to own your own home. But the mission to make Britain a country that works for everyone means more than fighting these injustices. So she was sort of addressing everyone. This wasn't a speech for the toffs. This was a speech for, I want to make Britain fairer. It was a very, what we call a one-nation view of conservatism. And almost had policies that were ripped directly from Ed Miliband's manifesto in 2015. So some people called it like the Miliband speech, or what could have happened if Labour had made it to power in 2015. So, yeah, she was seen as very, very middle of the road. And there were political reasons for her making that speech as well. At a time where Jeremy Corbyn seemed to have moved the Labour Party to the left, and people really didn't know what he stood for yet. I think the 2017 general election gave us a chance to know more about what Jeremy Corbyn wanted to put forward. Theresa May offered a haven for those in the centre ground who, sort of wanted to rally behind someone who was up for making the country fairer, making the rich pay their taxes, but also keeping the economy balanced and strong at the same time. So taking her at that speech and taking her from the word go, she seemed to be a capable leader. But I think the cracks started to show quite soon after, and what she did in the run up to the 2017 general election. I mean, does that share your view broadly of the time? With those speeches, what she was putting herself across. Did you think this was, you're a Remainer yourself? Did you think she'd be able to deliver a softer Brexit? From the word go.
Yeah, I think as you said, I can't pull out. I mean, I know we've posted this statement, but I couldn't have told you any particular part of that speech, though I'm pretty certain I saw it. But yeah, I think my initial concerns, to do with the Home Office stuff, at least in the speech and her initial actions, I was like, well, she's a Remainer. It's better than having someone who's a massive Brexiteer in charge, because they'll just take us out with no deal. And I thought, it's going to be okay. It's very hard to put myself back into those shoes, because this is before, what the premature premature initiation of Article 50 and all of that, which I think since then it's just been error after error, and often unforced errors, I would argue. At least that's how it seems to me. And I think we've kind of discussed that point before, although we'll touch on it later. But yeah, I think I was like, oh, well, at least she's a Remainer. And I kind of thought that was, you'd get the best compromise out of that. Someone who's like, well, we still have to leave because that's the way the vote's gone. But yeah, getting a softer Brexit, some kind of customs union, I was like, if it has to happen, that's the kind of thing I would have preferred. Yeah, I think essentially I agree with what you said.
So moving on from that, you've got her presenting herself as quite middle of the road, and then that quite quickly changes come 2016 and her party conference speech, which famously includes the lines, if you're a citizen of the world, essentially you're a citizen of nowhere. Let me see if I can grab the direct quote. Okay, there we go, yeah. But if you believe you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere, you don't understand what the very word citizenship means. And
it's
this
quite a change in tone.
Yes. This whole speech is sort of an attack on the metropolitan elite. Another extract from the speech I've got here is, just listen to the way a lot of politicians and commentators talk about the public. They find your patriotism distasteful, your concerns about immigration or parochial, your views about crime illiberal, your attachment to your job security inconvenient. They find the fact that more than 17 voters decided to leave the European Union simply bewildering. Because if you're well off and comfortable, Britain is a different country and these concerns are not your concerns. It's easy to dismiss them, easy to say that all you want from government is for it to get out of the way. But the change has got to come and it's time to remember the good that government can do. In that entire speech, she is frankly reaching out to the Labour voters that voted UKIP, the Labour voters that voted Brexit, the people who she thinks that the new Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn was leaving behind, and that was a possible big win for her to pick up. If she's able to pick up those working class voters, then she could have cemented a sort of a Tory dynasty that could have lasted for years. That was her play there, and that also sort of fed into her Brexit rhetoric. You know, we've heard she said Brexit means Brexit, kind of reinforcing that, you know, it is what I say it is, essentially. She also mentioned that no deal is better than a bad deal. That was the other bit that came out before any of this election, saying, no, I will strive to get the best deal for this country and I'm willing to play hardball. All sort of very hard Brexity type stuff. I believe that all of that rhetoric and the reaction that she got from the polls. So I've had a look back at our Britain Elect site. I believe it was, let me just get the exact date. On the 28th of April 2017, the Conservatives were 20 points ahead in the polls. Unheard of in years. Like when we've been moving from a time where we've had a coalition government under Cameron that was very close, the polls were incredibly close in the 2015 election, to have such a big swing. She must have been on cloud nine and thinking that everything she was saying was just gold dust. She could do no wrong.
A quick aside for the listeners. For reference, the Tories are now polling at 23.8%, which is their lowest since 1997.
Yeah, a lot can change in 2 years, I think that proves. Yeah.
2 years is an exceedingly long time in politics.
So I wanted to just quickly ask you, Tom, so on the eve of that, I know it's a bit hard to think back to this moment in time, but before the general election, before it was even called, or maybe just on the moment that she decided to call one, had your opinion changed of Theresa May from that point, from 2015 to 2017? Do you think she'd hardened, and do you think that, I don't know if you ever would have voted for Theresa May, and had you had the option to in 2015, but
so had I had to vote in 2015, I would have been in a constituency that was overwhelmingly Conservative. So it wouldn't have really mattered what I'd done. And I think I actually ended up voting for Greens in that election. And I did it via a proxy vote because at the last minute I wasn't actually in my constituency due to work. So yeah, I think it was very much I need to vote for something, and there was no chance of Labour or anything getting in, and I was like, well, maybe the Greens will get a tiny percentage here to at least show that they're not Conservative here. So yeah, that was the vague plan. And then come 2017, I was living in an area that's now very Liberal Democrat. It was Conservative, but we've only been Conservative for that 2-year gap from 2015 to 2017, and I think people got very annoyed at the MP, actually, because he was making all sorts of claims about how he'd tried to fix the train station and everything, and it was basically him using his budget as an MP to send out free kind of electioneering material, which is, I think that rubbed people up the wrong way, and so we're back to having the Lib Dem MP we had in the coalition here. Back in 2017, I remember being that was the first time I really was kind of tracking everything, and there was that new app out, which I don't think you can get anymore, that gave you all the poll stuff. I was more into it than I had been in a long time probably since we voted in the coalition. Because 2015 came as a bit of a shock, I think, because suddenly the country seemed to go very conservative, but actually it was just the Lib Dems kind of fell out, and I'd kind of assumed coalition would be more likely, and then it wasn't. I'm trying to remember what I thought. I definitely agree with you that I feel, she'd hardened up, and I think, in my opinion, she'd gone down. But where I was, it was a choice between Conservatives and Lib Dem, and I chose to back, with the rest of the constituency, the local Lib Dem. So I wouldn't have voted for her in that election anyway, but I definitely feel like there was nothing she could have done at that point, whereas maybe in 2015, if they'd been like, look, the kind of argument she has been making, which is like, look, someone has to get Brexit done, and it's going to be kind of sensible. Like, that could have been spun in a good way in 2015, but by 2017, I think it was obvious that she wasn't going to deliver the kind of Brexit that I would kind of begrudgingly put up with. So yeah, it was a fun fact on that election, actually. I was flying back from Japan during the election. Did you know you can ask the flight attendants to go up to the cockpit and they can have the current results radioed to them? And I had a tiny little slip of paper with the current standing of all the parties presented to me at like 4 a.m. UK time. So, if you're really into your politics and you're in the air, you can get that done, at least on a BA flight.
So, yeah, that airport fact aside, to move us back to the 2017 election. So that move was to be her undoing, and I'm going to argue tonight that that's essentially what began her downfall. And if you look at the polls, I think it's very hard to argue against that. It certainly dented her view amongst the public. What we experienced in the 2017 election campaign was 6 months of focus on Theresa May and her policies and what she wanted to do with Britain. But bizarrely, that election wasn't really about Brexit. It was an election that became both parties just accepted they were going to do Brexit. And then once that point was done, it was brushed to the side and everybody looked at who would run a country in what way. When Theresa May came in front of the camera in that election, it soon became apparent to me that this wasn't someone who was a natural election campaign leader. She'd always been on the sides. It's it's a different job to be Home Secretary and to be competent in the realms of Whitehall. But to go out and talk to the general public, she appeared robotic. She earned that name Maybot for a reason, because her responses were stilted, and the way that she repeated the sort of strong and stable mantra that, maybe that was something that she'd been told to do by her campaign team rather than a personal decision, but it certainly didn't reflect on her very well. The policies the Conservative Party put through as well were a little baffling. They were, I think in retrospect, they were too realistic as a manifesto. They'd promised to deliver, sort of social care, but in moderation. When you compare it to the lofty ideals of the Labour campaign, that was somebody who, was really, Jeremy Corbyn was really pushing the boundaries of politics. He was offering a new type of politics. All the passion and enthusiasm was with him. With Theresa May, she was sort of offering you the same old thing, only slightly different. And in particular, some of those tweaks seemed to make things worse. There was an infamous speech on her social policy that basically, when the papers got hold of it, they went over it and revealed that that might lead to some elderly people having to sell their house or being forced to sell their house. And that undermined like a huge part of the Conservative sort of core vote. That annoyed a lot of people there. And then when questioned on it the next day, even though the policy had changed, Theresa May tried to put forward that they'd only re-clarified the policy and kept saying, nothing has changed, nothing has changed. And that's the one image I have of that election, of May suddenly realising that she's losing control. And day by day, the polls got closer and closer and closer. I think we all still believed that the Conservatives would get a majority and maybe increase on their majority from 2015. But maybe it wasn't going to be the Tony Blair landslide 1997 version that we thought it would be.
Yeah, I think I definitely went into that expecting them to win, and it was a question of by how much.
Yeah, precisely. When the results came through and it was clear that the Conservatives had actually lost their majority and that Labour had gained in a lot of places, maybe more scarily for May, that the Conservatives had lost their sort of seats in metropolitan areas. Exactly the areas that she'd attacked in London were now voting Labour. And the votes that she was picking up elsewhere in the countryside didn't seem to matter. Excuse me. I may have mentioned it before on this podcast, but that 2017 election was remarkable for a number of ways. The collapse of the third parties, the collapse of the Lib Dems and UKIP, meant that it became one of the most sort of blatant two-party politics races we've ever seen. And even though Theresa May was able to return with I think one of the biggest percentages of votes that we've had since like the mid-1960s or 70s, that wasn't enough when Labour did so equally well as well, and there was nobody else to split that vote. The result was that she came away from that election night tearful, with her pride and her authority dented, and with a parliament which was going to make it a lot harder for any Brexit business to be done. One of the big factors of calling this election was not only to wipe out the Labour Party, but was to give her enough of a majority within the House to easily pass her Brexit legislation. She knew she'd have people on the backbenches who would disagree with the way that she'd do it. She knew she'd have a couple of Jacob Rees-Moggs basically saying that, this deal isn't good enough, we should no deal. But that wouldn't be a problem if you've got a majority of 100, 150 in the House. Now she lacked it, and now she was forced to go and do a deal with the DUP, a deal that cost them £1 billion, and maybe people have questioned the effectiveness of that deal. It just brought more of Theresa May's decision-making process into question, and how she'd acted as a leader. And I think once 2017 was over, that's a blow from which she has never recovered, and it's only really got worse from there.
So, as we said, she's given her speech. Where are we going from here? So, do we want to briefly cover how the Conservative leader is picked at this point and move into that? So, as I alluded to earlier, we don't get a say in this. One of the slightly weird things about our system, I suppose, is that you don't have like a deputy prime minister. I mean, with the exception of in the coalition, it's not like, if Trump were impeached, then we know Mike Pence would take his place by default. We don't have that here. It's just the leader of the majority party is the leader of the country. So if we talked about this when we said Theresa May had her no confidence vote against her and things like that. So there are ways in which you can remove the leader of a party, and it's different for each party. This isn't like an agreed on thing. It's for the Conservatives, we have the 1922 committee, and for Labour, they have a different way of doing things. And there's no like clear order of succession. Like with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, we knew that they had some kind of deal, or at least people assumed, and then that's how that played out. Here, it's very much down to this kind of what I suppose outside can seem quite archaic and a bit backstabby, a bit Game of Thrones, we don't get a say as average citizens in that process. And in fact, last time I think even the Conservative Party members didn't get a say because basically everyone dropped out, leaving Theresa May as the last candidate. So she won by default. So how does that process work? Because it is a bit archaic in some ways. And then who have we got as our options?
The way the process works is that you must be nominated by a set percentage of MPs within your party. I think within the Labour Party it's 10%. I can't remember off the top of my head what it is within the Conservative Party, but you've got to have basically enough mates around you who think you can be PM to nominate you, so you've got a feasible candidacy. Then we have a series of votes where if we've got 11 candidates or if we've got 5, everybody votes for their favoured candidate, and the one with the lowest vote is knocked out. And then we do that again, and then we do that again, and that all just happens from MPs within the Conservative Party. So this tends to mean that the effect of this is that even though a candidate might be popular from the outside, if they are unpopular within their party, they are unlikely to make it to the front running. So in this system, Jeremy Corbyn wouldn't have stood a chance of getting the Conservative leadership. If the Labour leadership was run like the Conservative leadership, there's no way Jeremy Corbyn would ever have become leader, because he barely had the support of the MPs to get him nominated and onto the Labour ballot. And then if they had a vote, he would have been knocked out in the first round. This has also led to sometimes the public frontrunner being knocked out before the public get a chance to vote. So in the case of Michael Portillo, I believe he was eliminated very early on in a Conservative leadership election, similar with Ken Clarke, these big beasts of the Conservative Party who commanded respect and many thought were natural leaders, just didn't have the support of the party to go forward. So that's the first stage. The second stage is once you've got the last two, you then put that to a vote amongst the wider Conservative Party membership. So for that, you have to be a card-carrying, paid-up Conservative member. I believe you have to have been a member for a set time before the election. So
I believe it's at least 6 months, because someone mentioned that at work today, because I think one of their relatives had joined the Conservative Party around December and therefore was unsure exactly. Like, it basically depends when the vote gets called, whether they'll be fine.
I'd be interested to hear that relative's decisions for joining the Conservative Party in December. I don't think they're now's the time to join. Anyway, so that stops there being a rush of like Labour people suddenly buying £5 memberships and trying to influence the result of the election. So that's the process, and that's as close as it gets to democracy for the Conservative Party. The aim, you may see it as archaic, and it certainly is maybe one of the less democratic methods that any party has for electing its leader. When you compare it to Labour's, which I think you only need the nomination of 10% of the MPs, then the rest of the whole process is entirely done on public vote. The Conservatives put the command of MPs of much higher importance than the actual leaders, love across the country, their popularity across the country.
And I mean, I think that ties into some stuff we said about the Conservatives before, where they're kind of about sticking together, and like the way the party operates tends to be with the interests of the party at heart. So they wouldn't want to have someone picked who they hadn't already been like, oh, he's all right or she's all right.
Yeah, precisely. And I think that might put everybody's sort of nailing Boris Johnson on to be one of the final two, but I'm unsure of his popularity within the Conservative Party. He's been around a long while and has talked a lot of nonsense, quite frankly, from time to time. And although he's made friends amongst the ERG, I know people like Jacob Rees-Mogg are backing him, for example. There are big factions within the Conservative Party that would vote against him given the choice. Yeah, in short, the Conservative Party leadership is meant to deliver a strong leader and a united party. That's what they consider of the most importance when it comes to this. And once it's been to the members, and the members have decided, most of the time the party will pull together and, follow the person that the membership has elected.
So, given that the problem Theresa May has had is coming up with a deal that satisfies the Brexiteers, the Remainers, etc. in her party, how easy a job do you think that's going to be for anyone else? Because I think we've repeatedly said that regardless of what you may think about Theresa May, she has at least tried to get on with possibly the worst job you could be handed, which is trying to make that deal work for everyone. What kind of line could someone take to try and appease both ends? I mean, let's assume they don't get the very strong Brexiteers and the very strong Remainers either end, but we're trying to get say 80% of the people in the middle on side. How likely is that?
At this stage, unlikely. The Conservative Party is more split than it's ever been, in my opinion. And the possibility of getting a deal which all sides agree on is slim. For everybody who wants a no deal, or who is, when Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg were willing to accept May's deal at the final hour, there were still those within the Conservative Party who said that the deal wasn't soft enough and wanted a more sort of Commons Union-based approach. So May's almost done as much as she can there and has still failed. So they could go back to Europe and could get a better deal, and maybe a sort of customs union one would help to get the Labour Party on board. But as it is for unity within the Conservative Party, that is an incredibly tough thing to do at the moment. The other option they have is that they could call a general election. They could say, well, I believe that if I'm Conservative leader and let's say Boris Johnson does win, or somebody who's quite Brexity wins, being quite Brexity for the Conservative leader would be a good play because they can have a look at the polls, they can see the sort of support that the Brexit Party is getting, They would go, right, if we do this sort of hard line and we're able to win significant amount of votes with this message, then we could put forward a much harder deal altogether. The problem with that is that the Conservatives have just lost a large amount in the council elections and are likely to lose in the European elections as well. It would be a very brave, and I would argue a very foolish Conservative leader that would call a general election at this stage. So as it is for party unity or changing that party math, the options they've got are zilcho. None, nada, nothing. I think I've tried to make that point. I was listening to another podcast today and they put it quite well. They said that Theresa May's the driver who's crashed the car, and now they're all on foot and they're looking for somewhere to go, and it's pretty tough to be told by the person who's crashed the car that you've got to walk faster. So getting rid of her and putting somebody else in charge to give the Conservatives that message might make it a little more palatable, might be enough to get some Conservatives to group together. But the point is the car is still crashed. They're still in a terrible position, and I don't know if anyone can bring all of them back on board, particularly when Brexit isn't resolved at this stage. You just as it was a bit of a poison chalice when Theresa May became leader back in sort of after the referendum in 2016, now is an even more poison chalice for a Conservative leader. You are talking about the future of the Conservative Party staying together at this state. If the next one gets it wrong, it could go very wrong.
So there's 14 contenders for the leadership race. It's 8 men, 6 women. That's a better split than I think A, the Houses of Parliament, and B, the Conservative Party as a whole. So that's good. I mean, we have just had a female Prime Minister, which might help with the ratios there. I mean, I don't know. Do you want to... Well, I mean, maybe if I quickly run through them and give like a very brief overview, because we probably don't have the time to dive in depth tonight to each of their histories. But do we want to have quite a quick overview? And I'll maybe, if I go first, because you probably remember more about them, and then you can give your response.
I'll try and keep my response quick to 2 sentences, and if you want me to go into more detail, then let me know.
Okay. This is just the order they're in on the BBC website at the moment. So, Boris Johnson, former mayor of London, famously rugby tackled a child, got stuck waving some flags from a zip wire, which is one of the best gifts you can find. Yeah, I mean, basically, you all know who Boris Johnson is, and I probably don't need to explain who he is. There's often been suspicion that he would eventually become leader of the Tory party. But yeah, he's famous because he's been quite a character. He's done, in the same way some people now are aware of Rees-Mogg because of Have I Got News For You, Boris Johnson got there first on that. I mean, not to say there weren't other politicians, like Ken Livingstone was also on Have I Got News For You back in the day, but definitely he's kind of been more in the public eye, and weirdly does well abroad, considering he seems to go and when he was Foreign Secretary at least, and outside of that, he seems to offend anyone he meets. I don't think he's a good example. I mean, maybe he is a good example of what Brexit Britain's like, but I don't think he represents me, would be what I would say, essentially. That's my feeling on him. I don't really want Boris in charge. I feel like he doesn't deserve it after he kind of got us in this pickle in the first place and then kind of, just wandered away from it. I know he got screwed over by Gove, but also, yeah, I mean, I feel like he can't just keep having a go at it, as it were. So next up, there's Andrea Leadsom. Now, I don't know much about Andrea Leadsom. I haven't learnt much more about her, I would say, since the last leadership contest, where all I remember is thinking she was a bit more conservative than Theresa May, and that was a bad thing in my mind. And also then she said some horrible things about Theresa May, and that's essentially how she lost her leadership bid. I don't know if people have forgotten enough about that, but she has, like, earlier in the week, she was, she resigned from her post in order to kind of like set all of this up, I suppose. So, she's manoeuvred herself well recently. I don't know if my opinion of her has really improved since before. Dominic Raab. He was Brexit minister, famously forgot we were an island. Don't feel like he should be in charge of anything, really. But, I suppose, yeah, he's heavy on Brexit, and we've already kind of discussed the pros and cons of having a heavily Brexit Prime Minister. in this situation. Michael Gove, we've already made the point in previous episodes, I think, about Michael Gove. He used to be a writer for the Times.
I'll do it. I'll
yes.
drive the plane. I'll fly the plane. Sorry.
But I mean, Michael Gove also kind of lumped in with Boris Johnson, a bit useless and backstabby and out for himself, and I don't like him. Jeremy Hunt, the only man alive who has his own rhyming slang. I mean, no one wanted him to be health secretary for like the entire time he was health secretary, apart from himself. And now he's foreign secretary, and he's only doing well in that role, I suppose, because by comparison, he's not Boris Johnson. Again, I don't feel like he should be Prime Minister. Sajid Javid, he is probably, out of all of them, I mean, maybe there's a few others lower down, he hasn't done anything that's really annoyed me. So I think he's probably like all right out of the options. He's done some stupid stuff, obviously, but he's currently Home Secretary, and I think he's kind of made the usual number of political gaffes. I can't remember something like really bad that he's done, but please correct me if I'm wrong when it gets to your trying to run through them. Rory Stewart made some promise about prisons when he was prisons minister that I can't remember off the top of my head. Oh, he made some pledges, I think, about prisons, and then he resigned because they didn't reduce levels of violence and stuff like that. So he's made some mistakes, but like in the traditional kind of political vein, where it probably people have forgotten about that. You can Google it, but I bet everyone's forgotten that he was even prisons minister. Liz Truss has had she's made some weird YouTube videos I've seen. Again, I don't know too much about her, but the secret barrister in 2016 was like, after only 5 months, I can't, support her as Secretary of State for Justice. So, she's made some silly decisions again. Amber Rudd, I can't remember anything in particular, but she was in the Home Office, wasn't she? After, she was the one who fell on her sword for Windrush, right?
Yeah, she was. Yeah,
but really, it wasn't necessarily her fault. But I feel like she just won't do very well because of the association with that. Even though I feel like more of the Windrush stuff actually falls at Theresa May's feet than it does at hers. I think we discussed at the time that she kind of fell on her sword because then everyone will hopefully forget about the fact that she was involved, and come next leadership contest, she would be available. But yeah, she is Remain, which at least is, she's in the cabinet and a Remainer. Matt Hancock, who's the current health secretary, I literally know nothing about. He's just very smiley, judging from his picture. Priti Patel, I couldn't find any obvious things she's done to annoy people other than her local constituents are a bit annoyed that she hasn't really represented them in Parliament. But nothing like on a national scale that worries me. Esther McVeigh, I don't know much about either. She's a quick Google didn't bring up anything like she's done that's stupid. She's just kind of been an opposition to Theresa May recently. Penny Mordaunt, again, I haven't seen anything in particular that's like she's screwed up. So again, some of these people are backbenchers, so it may just be they haven't really had the opportunity. She's currently for Defence Secretary, to be clear, but quite a few of these people are backbenchers, so they've been able to maybe shout from the sidelines. You may have heard their name, but I don't know anything about them at all. And then finally, Sir Graham Brady, who is currently a backbencher but head of the 1922 committee. So I don't know if you've clicked on him on that link, but he said, "I've been urged by a number of colleagues from across the party, from inside Parliament and outside, asking me to put myself forward as a candidate. Therefore, I've made the decision to stand down as chair of the 1922 committee in order to ensure a fair and transparent election process." So I feel like, I mean, maybe he will end up just winning because he's been around in the party for a long time and is trusted. But I feel like maybe he's... my kind of impression is that he's kind of... A few people have asked him to stand, and he's like, okay, fine then. But isn't necessarily, like, planning on winning it.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
And then that's my rundown. So feel free to disagree with me or have far more dirt on them than I do.
Cool. Quickly, Boris Johnson, I think... You know about Boris Johnson, you either like him or don't. My personal opinion is that if he had stood after 2012, where he was quite loved by all the country, he was seen as sort of like a lovable buffoon. That was his biggest chance to go for, a prime ministership, or, that was when he was outshining David Cameron, and many thought that this is the natural man to be the next leader of the Conservative Party. Usually that doesn't happen. Natural leaders of the Conservative Party don't tend to do well. There are many examples through history, like Anthony Eden and Sir Douglas Hume. Usually the obvious front runner doesn't always do best, and I think he may just be past his prime. Andrea Leadsom, I don't think she's going to win, primarily because of the fact that she didn't win last time against Theresa May. She's sort of running again because she can, but all I know from my knowledge of her workings within the government as leader of the government and her actual effectiveness as a member of cabinet is that she's pretty rubbish. So I would not like to see her leader, and she's along the Christopher Grayling ministership. She's not that, I just don't think she's that competent. Dominic Raab, again, is an odd one. I think Dominic Raab seems to think very highly of himself, but I'm not sure anybody else within the Conservative Party does. He was very excited about becoming Brexit minister and then promptly resigned. So, again, I don't see him as a serious contender. Michael Gove, talking about people who think a lot about themselves, we've got Michael Gove here. He will do it. He will step forward, even if nobody really wants him to step forward at all. So he's throwing his cap into the ring, but again, I don't expect that he will have the groundswell of support from within the party to get very far. Jeremy Hunt's more interesting. I think Jeremy Hunt is one who is probably quite widely disliked by the general public because of his control of the NHS in particular. However, he is seen as, there's a reason why he's been in government so long and in the cabinet so long. They clearly like him within the party and feel that even though we might not agree with his decisions, he's at least competent in following those orders. So he might be an outsider in this race. He's at least a recognisable figure. But when push comes to shove, I don't think he'll make it to the final two. Saeed Javid is very interesting. He's one of my ones to watch out for, even though he's been quite controversial and it can be quite sort of right-wing and Brexity. That the fact that he is a BME candidate, the fact that he would be something very different for the Conservative Party and could appeal to a whole new section of the electorate does make him quite an attractive prospect for the Conservative Party looking to unite. So I'd say he's certainly one to look out for. Rory Stewart, I couldn't tell you much about him. You couldn't tell me much about him. I think he's just standing because he can. Liz Truss, talking about people who can stand because they can. I don't think very much of Liz Truss. A lot of people put their names forward. I just don't see where that swell of support is going to come for her within the Conservative Party. Amber Rudd's very interesting. Amber Rudd is kind of Theresa May 2.0. So do you remember during the 2017 election when Theresa May decided that she wasn't going to do any debates?
Yes, she sent Amber Rudd as her proxy.
She did, and that left a lot of people thinking, why isn't Amber Rudd leader? She's doing a lot better job at this than Theresa May has done in any of her campaigns so far. So she's a Remainer, she's worked in the Home Secretary, she's sort of Theresa May 2.0 in the fact that she's got similar ideas to Theresa May, but is far more sort of palatable. She's the iPhone of Theresa May's sort of basic Android status. So she might be able to command some sort of part of the party to vote for, maybe the ex-Theresa May faction, certainly. But that might just not be what the Conservative Party is looking for at the moment. They might not want another Theresa May at this stage. Matt Hancock, again, he seems to be a quick riser within the party. I think he's quite soferable, he appears on the Daily Politics and on Question Time and smiles and gets on with it. But again, I don't think he's a serious front runner. Priti Patel she almost falls into the Gove category of, why are you running? You must really think highly of yourself. You said that she didn't have any dirt on her, but her resignation from the cabinet in 2017, when it was disclosed she had a series of unofficial meetings with senior Israeli officials.
That was her. Okay, yes, I knew there was something I'd heard about her before. Okay, yeah. Yeah,
that was her sort of going in the face of all ministerial protocol. She couldn't just plead ignorance on this one. It's sort of page 1 of the Code of Ministerial Conduct is that you don't have meetings in secret with other foreign officials. And And then when she was called in by Theresa May, she was pretty blasé about it and basically dared Theresa May to fire her, thinking that Theresa May couldn't do it because she was too weak, and in the end lost her job. And she seemed quite unremorseful since. So again, I don't think that she would be a good leader of the party and may not be what they're looking for. Now, Esther McVey sort of falls into my Liz Truss category of, why are you standing? Yeah.
Another backbencher who doesn't really do much, essentially.
Yes, she's sort of like big on Twitter and tweets a lot of like controversial stuff. But again, she's like Twitter famous, not actual famous. She was a former TV presenter, apparently, so that's probably why she's Twitter famous. Yeah,
but she didn't manage to get at Esther McVey. She's at Esther McVey1 on Twitter. So.
Not that good. Penny Mordaunt, again, is another one. She's a prominent Brexiteer within the cabinet who has risen quickly and clearly has ambitions for leadership. She sort of reminds me of Kelly Hawke's character in The Bodyguard. But she's, again, I wouldn't say she's a serious contender. These sort of young and up-and-comings, they'll put their hat into the ring, fail this time round, but will use it as a learning experience for the next time. And I feel that's what a lot of these candidates are doing, or these Brexiteers who are putting them in, saying, well, now's as good a time as any. Let's give it a stab. And finally, Sir Graham Brady, I find that really interesting that he's stepped down from his role of the 1922 committee in order to run. I don't think he would have run by himself unless he was prompted to do so. So that's clear that there is a sort of little sort of corner of the Conservative Party that believes that this man who has run the 1922 committee so well might be able to be the man to unite the party and at least get them all singing off the same hymn sheet, even if nobody else in the country has really heard of him. Being a Sir, I can't remember if being a Sir he would be like one of the first, so like lords or like to run. Let me just get my point across there. Like, a Sir doesn't make you a lord, but I'm not quite sure where that. I can't remember anybody else with the title Sir running for Prime Minister off the top of my head. So that would make him a sort of odd one to stand out. He's very much the internal Conservative Party man, in which case he might do far better than expected and far better than maybe some of the more prominent figures. But if he was to make it to the final two, I think he may struggle to win over the Conservative wider membership. So that's my 2 cents on all the candidates. Sorry if I've been a bit more dismissive of some than others. But to me, there's clear front runners there. There's a clear sort of there'll be a Remain Brexit split, and most of the people coming forward on this are Brexity. So I imagine a lot of those will cancel each other out, and by the time you get to the end, you will be left with a Brexiteer and a Remainer. Which Brexiteer and which Remainer, that remains to be seen.
We've run through the various people standing. You think about half maybe are just standing to kind of get the experience, and then there's the actual serious contenders. I feel we kind of agreed on Sajid, though, being kind of probably most likely hasn't made any major screw-ups. And I think that would be interesting, as you say. So I gave earlier the fact that there's 8 men and 6 women, but there are only 2 of them, Sajid and Priti, who are BAME members of Parliament. So yeah, maybe that is a strategy that could win out, because they can say, oh, more of a man of the people or woman of the people. Although, as you said, probably more likely that he's going to win out of the 2 of them. So I suppose we should probably wrap up there. One wild question: how likely do you think a general election is off the back of this?
Low. Again, low. Again, like, no Conservative leader within their right mind would call a general election until Brexit has been delivered. Brexit being delivered is unlikely through Parliament unless they can, by some miracle, get all of the Conservative Party to unite behind them. So the clearest path, or the simplest path for a Conservative leader would be to go in on a no deal platform. I will deliver no deal, let no deal happen, and then deal with the consequences later. Not the happiest thought for the time. But yes, and just for the front runners, so if I was to pick out, let's pick out 4 front runners, I would go Boris Johnson, you can never count him out, Syed Javid, Amber Rudd, and then Jeremy Hunt. And then my dark horse is going to be Sir Graham Brady, because I know little about him, but if he's got that support from within the party, he might force his way through.
And yeah, as you say, he's had to deal with people from all sides of the party, so people probably think, even if he isn't necessarily on all of their sides, people probably think he's on all of their sides because he's got to be that kind of mediator role already. So talking about general elections, shall we move on into our quick polls update?
Let's do that.
Yeah, so as always, we're going to... God, Sir Graham Brady has a lot of teeth. As always, we're going to Britain Elects to look at their Westminster voting intention. And as you load that up, Rob, I've already had this up. I'm going to give you my quick overview as always. It's since we last looked, it has either been Labour or a tie, because the Conservatives really fell off that cliff. Started in April, where it started in mid-March. They started dropping. April, they fell below the Labour Party, which had already had a minor bump, and they've just kept plummeting down. Labour has also now had a bump starting kind of mid-May, a negative bump starting mid-May, but they're kind of tracking the Conservatives down, and they're still about 5% ahead. And then we have our new kind of like third place is the Brexit Party, who unsurprisingly are kind of riding high after having had the European elections, where they will have been they'll have been in the public eye. I would expect that to probably level out a bit, because they only have one policy. But maybe, I mean, who knows? There are a lot of people who want Brexit, so maybe that they do better than that going forward. Lib Dems are now at 14%. That's the highest they've been in all of these charts that are on this page. If you go back to 2014, I don't know if they go back any further. No. Okay. Yeah, so since 2010, that's the highest they've been, 14%. Obviously, they had about 29% when they got into the coalition. And then UKIP has fallen off a cliff, and Greens have gone up slightly, and there's Change UK in there somewhere, but I don't think they're doing particularly well. Does any of that surprise you, Rob?
No, the rise of the Brexit Party is clearly the factor that's bringing the Conservatives down, and Labour to an extent, although some may argue that Labour's also hemorrhaging votes to the Lib Dems as well. Those sort of graphs seem to track with the rise of the Lib Dems, and the fall of Labour is roughly the same, and then do the same for the Brexit line and the Conservative line, and that's very similar as well. So I agree with that assessment. At the moment, the polls would put Labour as the biggest party, followed by the Conservatives, then the Brexit Party, then the Lib Dems. A note of caution about that would be that if a general election was held tomorrow, I think the Brexit Party would struggle to pick up a single seat in the country, much like UKIP in 2015, where they were the third largest party but won 0 MPs. The Brexit Party just don't have the structure, they don't have the support within constituencies their support is spread. They will do best in PR elections like the European elections, where I'd expect them to win, but in first past the post it's often a very different story. So we've got to temper what we think of the Brexit Party at the moment. Like you said, they're a party with one policy, and when put in a first past the post situation, I think a lot of people might be forced to vote Conservative or have it split, or decide to go another way when push comes to shove. But that's not to rule them out entirely. If they were able to get a similar result that the Lib Dems did back in 2010, they could go into coalition with somebody, or they could become kingmakers in a potential government, sort of a party forcing through their Brexit ideals onto another. So yeah, that's all I've got to say on the polls, and just a quick note of caution about that Brexit Party figure. They look impressive, and they've risen out of nowhere. But I don't expect that they'll be taking the top spot anytime soon.
They're just there to ensure Nigel Farage gets his European lunches still.
Yes, make sure he gets his spot on Question Time. Yeah,
because he's still leader of a party. Yes, so, well, thank you as always for joining me, Rob. Just some quick notes here. We want to cover the election results. I'm not going to be in the country for a bit, so I'm going to get this episode up and down on everyone's phones hopefully before tomorrow morning. And then we're going to try and do a recording with me in another country. I've got my travelling kit with me to try, but we'll see how that goes. We'll be running over the election results as and when they come out. So they come out, I think is it 8 p.m. or 10 p.m. on Sunday? but realistically, we're not going to be able to record at that time. So it's probably going to have to be a Monday recording for those of you who want to come and listen to us talking about elections, which are our favourite topic, really. And so that'll be interesting. And I think it will be very interesting with, as we say, 30% people polling for the Brexit Party. How does that work out with the MEPs? There's been a lot of stuff about tactical voting. It'll be very interesting to see how it all turns out. And we'll chat about it then. As always, you can find us in all the usual places. You can find us at parliamentary.observer. You can find us on reddit.com/r/unparliamentary. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at unparlpodcast. And you can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. And you can always go and support us on patreon.com/TTSS, where you will now be getting our news updates as like an audio file on there if you're a patron. And obviously it helps us fund some of the equipment and the web posting and various other things we need to produce this podcast, which, and also it's nice to have that show of confidence from our listeners, makes us keep wanting to do this. Although I'm sure we'd quite happily keep nattering about politics, even if there wasn't anyone listening, but it's always good to know that someone listens. And again, as always, thanks to the large group of people in the chat who've come and listened to us kind of pick apart Theresa May's reign as head of the Conservative Party and her downfall. Thank you all for joining us, and it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him.
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Jean-Michel Jarre is a fraud.